Okay, Jesus' temptation in the desert. A fairly familiar tale for everyone, and given that we're fresh into the season of Lent, this is a great opportunity for a little lesson. A little lesson on temptation and sin in general. After all, we are especially determined not to give in to temptation for the next 36 days or so. So we should probably have a solid idea of what that means in the first place. Now, as a matter of fact, Thomas Aquinas, a doctor of the church, had a thing or two to say about this. Specifically, he explained that sin has 5 components, and to actually commit a sin, you need all 5. They are as follows. Eyes, seeing an opportunity to sin in the first place. Mind, understanding how you could sin in that opportunity. Desire, wanting to sin. The will, choosing to sin. And finally, the act, going through the deed itself. So let's walk through this process with a nice, easy example. Abusing alcohol. I think we can all agree that abusing alcohol is a sin. It's unhealthy. It is potentially dangerous for the drinker and those around them, and it may lead to further sin. I think we're okay there. For someone to sin in that way, first they need to recognize the fact that they can get intoxicated by inhibiting booze. They need to know that they can obtain that booze from a store. They need to want to get drunk and choose to get drunk. And finally, they need to actually ingest the alcohol. That would be a sin, and the nearest confession is right over there. But think about what happens if even one of those things is missing. What if an alcoholic who really wants to drink, and they would drink if they could, but they're in rehab and they can't actually get the alcohol? They didn't really sin in a complete sense of the word. Or what if someone gets drunk because they ordered iced tea at a restaurant and accidentally got a Long Island iced tea? It happens. Okay, yes, they got drunk, but they didn't choose to do so. That's not a sin. That's a mistake. And finally, it wouldn't be a sin if someone truly didn't understand the sinful nature of over-drinking. I realize that last one isn't terribly likely, but if we're being logical about this, it's got to be said out loud. In the same vein, if someone wanted to do something but didn't choose it, we're in the same boat. Now, here is how this fits into the reading. Jesus had 3 temptations to sin and did not sin. Okay, that's the whole point of the story, right? Well, consider this. Jesus definitely saw the opportunity to sin. The devil spelled it out for him. And Jesus also thought about the sin. Otherwise, how could he have responded to the devil in the way that he did? So Jesus got steps 1 and 2 of Aquinas' process, and no sin was present. What Jesus succeeded at, to be precise, was his firm choice not to sin. That was step 4. I would say that Jesus even had a little bit of step 3, desire. Not desire to sin, obviously, but the first temptation was for food, and Jesus was certainly hungry. To say that Jesus had no desire for bread after 40 days of going hungry is pretty much the same as saying that Jesus wasn't fully human in the first place. Sin and desire are related, but they are not the same exact thing. Simple desire in of itself does not make you a sinner. A man who really wants a cigarette but chooses not to smoke has not sinned. As a matter of fact, his goodness is made all the more heroic given the difficulty of the temptation in the first place. The same thing goes for faltering faith. A person who feels weakness and doubt in their faith but sticks through it with Christ anyways is not a sinner. There's someone who is strong in weakness through the Holy Spirit and absolutely nothing less. So that is the systematical approach to temptation and sin as understood by the church, the act of turning away from God with your thoughts, your hearts, and your deeds. Now, as I'm sure many of you are thinking, the real world isn't quite that simple. Living out your life of faith in reality is a lot more complicated than 5 easy steps to sin. We are not living in one big ethics classroom, after all. So what I'm getting at is that sometimes the process from Thomas Aquinas breaks down. Sometimes sin does happen, even if all 5 steps aren't obviously present. I'm going to have time, I think, for 2 examples. First and foremost is when we choose to dwell with our sin in our thoughts. Even if we don't do anything about it outwardly, it can still be sinful to relish bad things in our heads. You know, it's like when Jesus says that we commit adultery when we gaze upon a woman lustfully. Now, if you see an attractive person on the street and think, wow, what a stunning person, that is fine. That is an honest thought. But once we start to objectify them, you know, in our heads, as if they belong to us and they just don't know it yet, that's the problem. That's what Jesus is warning about. I think Aquinas would say that such a train of thought would be a different kind of sin than acting upon it, but it would still be a kind of turning away from God in our heads. And it would be good to avoid those sorts of thoughts as best we can. Now, the other way sin can creep into us is when it comes up indirectly. Let's go back to that example of the Long Island iced teas, okay? The consumption of alcohol may not be sinful because it was an accident, but perhaps the real sin would be the negligence to look carefully at the menu and be aware that the iced tea at that restaurant was alcoholic. You know what I mean? Sometimes the harmful act isn't sinful so much as placing oneself in an environment where sin can flourish within us. The phrase that comes to mind is to avoid the near occasion of sin. So we need to be on guard because the devil can be crafty like that. So, for the rest of Lent, devote your energies to resisting sin and temptation as best you can. Keep your desires focused on the good and the holy, and choose to turn away from sin, even when that desire is pulling on your heartstrings. And keep yourself living a lifestyle that limits sin in the first place. You can do it. Your Lenten sacrifice is supposed to help you along, and when you mess up, not if, when you mess up somehow, the sacrament of confession is there precisely for those times of weakness or foolishness when they get the better of us.